Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. This video explores complex geographic, demographic, and sociological data, and does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Family law, custody regulations, and socioeconomic impacts vary significantly by state and individual circumstances. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with licensed professionals regarding any specific legal or personal matters. If you were to look at a map of the United States, you could see the mountains, the rivers, and the state lines. But there is a hidden map, one that dictates the lives of millions of men across the country, yet remains invisible to the naked eye. This is the map of the American divorced dad. Right now, in the United States, there is a specific geographic corridor where a father is nearly 40% more likely to be living in a single-person household than in the rest of the country. There are zip codes where the economic reality of child support and dual household maintenance has created what sociologists call the secondary migration of men. We are witnessing a massive, silent shift in the American landscape where geography determines not just where a man lives, but how he relates to his children, his wealth, and his future. Most people think divorce is a personal failure or a random occurrence. The data suggests otherwise. It suggests that where you live might be the single greatest predictor of whether you will remain in a nuclear family unit or become a statistic in the growing demographic of the displaced American father. This is not just about a breakup. This is a deep dive geographic study into the demographics of divorced dads in the U.S. The problem this study solves for the American audience today is the lack of clarity regarding the structural and regional forces that shape the lives of men after a domestic dissolution. By understanding these geographic trends, we can move past the stigma and look at the hard data. We are going to analyze why certain regions create higher rates of paternal displacement, how cost of living indexes in specific states are forcing a new kind of commuter fatherhood, and what the historical trends tell us about the future of the American family. This is the masterclass in the sociology of the modern American male. To begin this geographic study, we must first look at the macrodemographic landscape. According to historical trends derived from the U.S. Census Bureau, there are approximately 2.5 million fathers in the United States who are currently divorced and living apart from their children. Yet this number only scratches the surface when we factor in the gray divorce phenomenon. To understand the geography, we have to look at the divorce belt. This is a region stretching from the southeast, through the Bible Belt, and into the southwest. It is a historical paradox that states with the highest reported levels of traditional values often see the highest rates of divorce among men. For instance, in states like Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Nevada, the rate of divorced men per capita consistently outpaces the national average. In these regions, the demographic profile of the divorced dad is often tied to earlier marriage ages. When we examine the case studies of these states, we find a direct correlation between the age of first marriage and the eventual geographic concentration of divorced fathers. Men who marry before the age of 24 in high-growth Sun Belt states are statistically more likely to enter the divorce demographic by their mid-30s. This creates a specific urban-suburban sprawl of bachelor apartment complexes and transient housing in the outskirts of cities like Oklahoma City or Las Vegas. These are not just buildings, they are geographic markers of a shifting social class. Furthermore, we must analyze the economic migration of the divorced father. In high cost of living areas, particularly in the Northeast Corridor and the West Coast, the demographic of the divorced dad is defined by geographic downsizing. Consider a case study in the Silicon Valley or the New York tri-state area. When a household splits in these high-tax, high-rent environments, the father is often the one who must migrate to a different geographic tier. This creates a demographic of satellite dads who live in lower-cost zip codes, sometimes 2 or 3 hours away from their children's primary residence, simply to maintain the financial obligations of their previous life. The data shows a growing concentration of divorced men in the outer ring suburbs of major metropolitan areas, creating a new geographic demographic that is physically separated from the cultural and economic centers where their families remain. When we look at the Rust Belt, the demographics shift again. In states like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the divorced dad demographic is heavily influenced by the decline of manufacturing and the resulting economic instability. Historical trends in these regions show that divorce rates for men often mirror the closure of major industrial plants. Here, the geographic study reveals a stagnant demographic. Unlike the mobile fathers of the Sun Belt, divorced dads in the Rust Belt tend to stay in the same geographic radius, often moving back in with aging parents or into multi-generational housing units. This creates a unique demographic pocket where the divorced father is integrated back into his family of origin, a trend that is significantly less common in the more transient Western states. We also have to account for the legal geography of the United States. The demographics of divorced dads are inextricably linked to state-level legislation. In no-fault states versus states with more traditional family court precedents, the geographic distribution of custody arrangements varies wildly. This creates what we call custody deserts. There are regions in the U.S. where, based on historical legal outcomes, the demographic of the primary custody father is almost non-existent. Conversely, in states that have moved toward presumptive 50-50 custody like Kentucky or Arizona, we see a different geographic pattern. In these states, divorced fathers are more likely to remain in high-quality school districts, maintaining a demographic presence in the suburbs rather than being pushed to the urban fringes. The step-by-step reality of this demographic shift begins with the departure phase. When a father enters the divorce demographic, his geographic footprint changes almost immediately. Data suggests that 60% of men move within the first 6 months of a filing. This initial move is usually determined by the proximity to the workplace, rather than the proximity to the former family home, creating a demographic of work-centric residents. Over time, as we look at the 5-year and 10-year markers, these men either move further away to seek lower costs or they attempt to re-anchor themselves in the community. As we deepen this study, we must also look at the health and longevity geography. There is a documented correlation between the density of divorced fathers in a specific region and the availability of men's health resources. In areas with high concentrations of divorced men, such as certain counties in Florida or Arizona, often associated with gray divorce, there is a corresponding rise in health services tailored to solo living older males. This demographic is characterized by higher disposable income but lower social connectivity, leading to a geographic isolation that is a major focus of modern sociological research. To truly understand this, we need to look at the intersection of geography and ethnicity within the divorced dad demographic. Historical trends show that the impact of divorce on paternal residency varies across different cultural landscapes in the U.S. In the Southwest, the demographic is heavily influenced by the transnational household, where divorced fathers may move across state or even national borders while maintaining financial ties. In the Southeast, the demographic is often tied to the rural-urban shift, where men move from rural family homesteads into urban centers to find the higher-paying jobs necessary to meet alimony and support requirements. We are not just looking at numbers on a page, we are looking at a fundamental restructuring of the American male experience. The geography of the divorced dad is a story of resilience, displacement, and the search for a new identity in a landscape that was originally built for the nuclear family. By examining these regional clusters, economic pressures, and legal environments, we can begin to see the true picture of what it means to be a father in America today. This study will continue to peel back the layers of this demographic, looking at everything from the post-divorce wealth gap to the digital nomad father, ensuring that by the end of this masterclass, you will understand the hidden forces shaping the lives of millions. To understand the geographic distribution of divorced fathers in 2026, we have to look past the surface-level statistics and dive into the financial fault lines created by state borders. Imagine a man named Mark. Mark is 44 years old, living in the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, in a 2-bedroom apartment he rented just 6 months ago. In 2026, the housing market has shifted significantly from the early 2020s, but for a man in Mark's position, the geography of his residence is dictated entirely by a calculation known as the Ohio Child Support Guidelines. Mark is a prime example of a historical trend where divorced fathers in the Midwest are often anchored to specific manufacturing or logistical hubs because their legal obligations are tied to their current income levels, which are locally indexed. If Mark were to move just a few hundred miles east into Pennsylvania, his entire demographic profile would shift. This is because Ohio and Pennsylvania, while neighbors, operate on different economic philosophies regarding the post-divorce male. In the geographic study of these men, we see a massive concentration of divorced fathers in what we call the ring cities. These are the secondary suburbs located 30 to 45 minutes outside of primary economic centers. The data from 2026 shows that these men are moving to these specific zip codes not by choice, but because these areas offer the precise balance of proximity to their children and a lower cost of living that allows them to meet their overhead. Historical trends suggest that this is the birth of the 2-bedroom demographic. In cities across the United States, there has been a 15% increase in the construction of mid-tier two-bedroom apartments, specifically in corridors that connect major employment centers with affluent family suburbs. Developers in 2026 are calling this the divorcee apartment, designed with a small second bedroom for weekend visits. This geographic clustering creates a unique social environment. When you look at the map of these apartment complexes, you are looking at the new centers of male social life. Now let us shift our geographic focus to the West Coast, specifically California, to see a different demographic outcome. Imagine a man named David. David is a project manager in 2026 who works in the high-tech sector of Orange County. Unlike Mark in Ohio, David's geography is defined by the commuter gap. Because the cost of living in coastal California has reached unprecedented levels in 2026, David has been forced to move to the Inland Empire, specifically toward Temecula or Riverside. This creates a demographic of the commuter father, a man who spends 10 to 15 hours a week on the road just to maintain a presence in his children's lives. The geographic study here reveals a shocking statistic. Divorced fathers in the western United States live, on average, 22 miles further away from their children than married fathers in the same socioeconomic bracket. This distance creates a physical and emotional friction that defines the demographic. Case studies of men in David's position show that this geographic displacement leads to a specific type of consumer behavior. These men are the primary drivers of the 2026 midweek economy in commuter towns, frequenting diners and gyms late at night because their primary social identity, being a father, is restricted to the geography of the weekend. When we analyze the historical trends of the Sun Belt, particularly states like Florida and Arizona, we see the rise of the sunset divorce demographic. These are men over the age of 55 who are entering the divorce demographic later in life. Their geography is not dictated by proximity to schools, but by proximity to medical care and leisure. In 2026, there are specific counties in Florida where the population of divorced men over 60 has doubled in the last decade. This is a migration of the solitary male. These men are often moving from northern states to the south to preserve their assets, creating a demographic of affluent but isolated fathers who are physically disconnected from their adult children and grandchildren. The data points to a concept called the zip code penalty. In the United States, your geographic location determines your tax status, your healthcare costs, and your legal standing. For a divorced father in 2026, moving across a county line can result in a potential outcome where his net disposable income drops by 12% due to local tax variances and child support recalculations. This has led to a phenomenon called geographic stagnation. Thousands of men are currently living in neighborhoods they no longer enjoy, in houses or apartments they cannot afford to upgrade, simply because the geographic cost of moving would trigger a legal review of their financial status. Step by step, we can trace how a man becomes part of this geographic demographic. It begins with the displacement. Usually, within the first 90 days of a separation, the father moves into temporary housing. In 2026, this is increasingly a short-term rental or a shared living space. The second step is the regional stabilization, where the father looks for a permanent residence within a specific radius of his children. The data shows that for every 5 miles of distance added between the father's home and the children's school, the frequency of midweek visitation drops by nearly 30%. This geographic reality creates a demographic of the weekend warrior, men whose entire paternal identity is compressed into a 48-hour window, once every 2 weeks. We must also look at the rural-to-urban pipeline. Historical trends indicate that divorced fathers in rural America are the most likely to experience a total geographic shift. In small-town America, the social and economic cost of divorce often forces men to migrate toward larger cities to find employment that can sustain 2 households. This results in the emptying of men from rural communities, leaving behind a demographic of aging residents and single-mother households. These men become invisible in the data because they are absorbed into the urban sprawl of cities like Dallas, Atlanta, or Phoenix, where they become part of the anonymous workforce. The 2026 economic landscape adds another layer to this study. With the rise of hybrid work models, some divorced fathers are attempting to leverage the digital nomad lifestyle to remain close to their children while living in lower-cost geographic regions. However, this creates a legal gray area. Historical trends in family law have not yet caught up with the 2026 reality of the remote worker. A father living in a van or moving between airbands to follow his children as they move with their mother creates a demographic of the high-mobility father. These men are constantly shifting their geographic footprint, making them the most difficult demographic to track and support. This geographic study is not just about where people sleep, it is about the infrastructure of the American family. When we map out where divorced dads live, we are mapping the heart of a social crisis. We are seeing the physical manifestation of economic pressure, legal constraints, and emotional displacement. We are seeing how the American landscape is being carved into zones of paternal presence and zones of paternal absence. But there is a darker side to this map. There is a specific geographic phenomenon occurring in the United States that most people are completely unaware of. It involves the way state borders are being used as strategic weapons in custody disputes, and it is creating a new class of men who are essentially geographic refugees within their own country. If you think the commute or the cost of living is the biggest challenge these men face, you are only seeing half the picture. To understand the true demographic shift, we have to look at the secret maps that family law attorneys use to advise their clients on where to live and where to flee. What happens when a man realizes that his geographic location is the primary reason he is losing access to his children and his wealth? The answer lies in the legal migration patterns of 2026, and the data is more explosive than you can imagine. The geographic location of a father at the moment of filing for divorce is often the single most significant variable in determining his financial and paternal future. This is because the United States does not operate under a single unified family law system. Instead, it is a fragmented patchwork of 50 distinct legal ecosystems, each with its own historical trends and potential outcomes. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of the strategic legal migration, where men are analyzing state-level data to decide where they should plant their roots before a domestic dissolution occurs. To understand this, we have to look at the massive divide between community property states and equitable distribution states. Imagine a man named James. It is 2026, and James is a senior systems engineer living in a high-rise in Seattle, Washington. Washington is one of the 9 community property states. In this geographic region, the law essentially views a marriage as a 50-50 financial partnership. Everything acquired during the marriage is split right down the middle, regardless of who earned it. For James, this geographic reality means that his demographic profile post-divorce is almost certain to involve a 50% reduction in net asset value. This is a predictable, albeit harsh, geographic certainty. However, if James were to live just a few hours away in a state that follows equitable distribution like Oregon, the outcome changes. In equitable distribution geography, the court has the discretion to divide assets based on what it deems fair, which is not always equal. This creates a demographic of men who are subject to judicial whim rather than a rigid statutory formula. In 2026, we are seeing historical trends where fathers in equitable distribution states are more likely to engage in prolonged, high-cost litigation to prove their contribution to the household, leading to a geographic concentration of high-debt divorced dads in the Northeast and parts of the Midwest. This leads us to the jurisdictional trap, a concept governed by a federal act known as the UCCJA, or the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act. This law dictates that the home state of a child is where they have lived for the 6 consecutive months prior to a legal filing. For a divorced father in 2026, this creates a demographic of the 6-month waiter. These are men who, realizing they are in a state with historically unfavorable custody outcomes, attempt to relocate to a more favorable jurisdiction. But here is the catch. They cannot move the legal battle until they have established residency for at least 180 days. Think about the physical reality of this. In 2026, there are specific neighborhoods in cities like Phoenix, Arizona, or Louisville, Kentucky, where there is a high density of men living in short-term furnished rentals. These men are essentially geographic refugees. They have moved to these states because Arizona and Kentucky have pioneered presumptive 50-50 custody laws. In these specific zip codes, the demographic of the divorced dad is one of transition. They are waiting for the clock to hit day 181, so they can file for divorce in a state that statistically treats fathers as equal parents from day one. This is not a guess. It is a calculated geographic maneuver to avoid the custody deserts found in states that still cling to outdated maternal preference doctrines. Furthermore, we must examine the geography of alimony or spousal support. In 2026, the map of the United States is split between states that have abolished permanent alimony and those that still allow it. Florida, for example, made massive legislative shifts in the early 2020s to end permanent alimony, and by 2026 we are seeing the demographic results. Divorced fathers in Florida are now more likely to remain in the workforce longer, and maintain a higher standard of living than their counterparts in states like New Jersey or Connecticut, where alimony can still be a lifelong obligation. This has created an alimony flight, where high-earning men in their 50s and 60s are moving their primary residence to the Sun Belt years before they anticipate a divorce, specifically to shield their future earnings from outdated regional statutes. Then there is the Texas cap. Texas is a fascinating case study in the geography of the divorced father. Texas has a statutory cap on child support for high earners that is significantly lower than in states like California or New York. In 2026, the Texas Triangle, the area between Dallas, Houston, and Austin, has become a massive demographic hub for divorced fathers in the top 10% of earners. These men are moving to Texas not just for the lack of state income tax, but because the geographic legal landscape provides a predictable ceiling on their support obligations. This allows them to maintain a level of capital that can be reinvested into their relationship with their children, such as maintaining a home in a premium school district, even after the split. But what about the men who cannot move? This creates the demographic of the geographic hostage. Imagine a father named Robert in 2026, living in a small town in Illinois. His ex-spouse wants to move the children to North Carolina for a new job. In Illinois, the move-away laws are relatively strict, requiring a showing that the move is in the best interest of the child. Robert's entire life is now a geographic battle. He cannot leave his town because if he does, he loses his legal leverage to keep his children close. He is stuck in a low-growth economic area, unable to pursue a better job in a different state, because his paternal identity is tied to a specific set of coordinates on a map. The step-by-step breakdown of this geographic lockdown looks like this. Step 1. The initial filing creates a status quo order, often preventing either parent from moving the children out of the county. Step 2. The father realizes that his career growth is tied to a different geographic region. Step 3. He is forced to choose between a 30% salary increase in a different state or seeing his children on a weekly basis. In 2026, the data shows that 80% of fathers choose the latter, leading to a demographic of underemployed dads. These are men who are overqualified for their current roles, but remain in them, simply to satisfy the residency requirements of their custody agreement. This demographic of underemployed dads is concentrated in suburban corridors across the Rust Belt and the Deep South. They are men who have sacrificed their economic trajectory for geographic proximity. This creates a secondary demographic shift where the wealth of divorced fathers is stagnating in specific regions, while the wealth of married households in the same regions continues to climb. We are seeing a widening wealth gap that is purely geographic in nature. As we look closer at the map, we see that the legal geography of 2026 is also creating a mental health desert. States with the most adversarial legal systems and the least amount of presumptive joint custody also report the highest rates of social isolation among divorced men. There is a direct line between the lack of 50-50 custody laws in a state and the number of divorced fathers who eventually stop engaging with their local communities altogether. However, there is an even deeper layer to this geographic study. While we have talked about the legal and financial maps, there is a hidden social architecture that these men are building to survive. In the shadows of these high-cost, high-litigation states, a new kind of community is forming. It is an informal, almost invisible network of fathers who are bypassing the traditional systems altogether. They are sharing resources, housing, and even legal strategies in a way that is starting to change the very demographic data we are studying. What happens when these men stop playing by the rules of the geographic lottery? What happens when the divorced dad demographic begins to unionize in a way that the government never anticipated? To understand the future of the American father, we have to look at the shadow economy of the displaced male. The next part of our study uncovers the secret networks and the unconventional living arrangements that are allowing these men to survive in an era of unprecedented geographic pressure. You will not find this data in a census report, but it is happening right now in every major city in America. The shadow economy of the American divorced father in 2026 is a complex, decentralized network that operates entirely beneath the surface of official census data and property records. To understand the geography of this demographic, we have to look at the rise of the shadow housing market. In major metropolitan areas like Denver, Austin, and Charlotte, a new type of residential pattern has emerged that sociologists are calling the paternal pod. Imagine a man named Kevin. Kevin is 42 years old and works as a mid-level analyst in Denver. In 2026, the average rent for a 3-bedroom home in a safe, child-friendly neighborhood in Denver has reached nearly $5,000 a month. For Kevin, whose income is split between high child support payments and his own living expenses, traditional solo housing is a mathematical impossibility. Instead of moving into a small, isolated studio apartment in a high-crime area, Kevin has joined a paternal pod. This is a strategic alliance where 3 or 4 divorced fathers collectively rent a high-end suburban home that none of them could afford individually. In 2026, historical trends show that these arrangements are increasing by 25% year-over-year in tech hubs. The geographic logic is simple. By pooling their resources, these men can remain in the premium school districts where their children reside, maintaining a demographic presence in affluent areas that would otherwise be closed to them. Kevin lives in a large house with 2 other fathers, Mike and Steve. They have a sophisticated, shared calendar system. When it is Kevin's weekend with his children, Mike and Steve move into the smaller guest rooms or spend the weekend at their own parents' homes, giving Kevin the space to provide a traditional home environment for his kids. This creates a demographic of the rotating resident. These men are physically present in high-value zip codes, but they do not show up as heads of households in traditional data sets. This geographic strategy allows them to bypass the cost of living crisis that usually pushes divorced men to the urban periphery. However, this shadow economy extends far beyond just housing. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of geographic bartering. Within these fatherhood networks, men are trading specialized professional services to avoid the high costs of the open market. A divorced father who is a licensed plumber in Atlanta might trade his labor to a divorced father who is a certified public accountant. This peer-to-peer economic system allows these men to maintain their financial stability and meet their court-ordered obligations without depleting their remaining liquid assets. Another invisible marker on our geographic map is the storage unit hub. In 2026, the self-storage industry in the United States has seen a massive surge in demand from men aged 35 to 55. For the divorced father, a storage unit is not just a place for extra furniture. It is a geographic anchor for his identity. Case studies of men in the Midwest reveal that these units often function as shadow living rooms or workshops. Because many divorced fathers are living in shared or temporary housing where they lack the space for hobbies or personal belongings, the 10 by 10 climate-controlled unit becomes the only space they truly control. In cities like Chicago and Indianapolis, there are industrial corridors where storage facilities have become informal social hubs for men on Saturday mornings. They go there to work on a car, organize their camping gear for an upcoming trip with their kids, or simply to exist in a space that isn't a rental. We must also analyze the geography of the exchange point. In 2026, the physical act of transferring children between parents has created a unique microdemographic at specific geographic coordinates. Historical trends have shown that neutral locations, such as fast food parking lots or police station safe zones, are the most common sites for these transitions. However, the data for 2026 shows a shift toward third space exchanges. These are suburban coffee shops, libraries, and community centers located exactly at the midpoint between the 2 parents' residences. If you were to map the density of these exchanges, you would see a ring of high activity approximately 15 to 20 miles outside of every major city center. This is the paternal friction zone. These locations see a massive influx of divorced fathers every Friday evening and Sunday afternoon, creating a localized economy centered around quick meals and short-duration activities. The role of the paternal grandparent is another critical geographic factor in 2026. As housing costs rise, we are seeing a demographic trend called the grandparent proxy. In many cases, the divorced father's parents are moving to be closer to their son's children, providing a secondary geographic base for the father. In states like Arizona and Florida, there is a growing concentration of multi-generational households where the divorced father lives with his own parents to reduce overhead. This demographic shift is creating a new type of suburban household that deviates from the traditional nuclear family model. It is a survival strategy that leverages the accumulated wealth of the older generation to keep the father geographically relevant in his children's lives. Furthermore, we need to look at the digital geography of 2026. Informal social media groups and encrypted messaging channels have replaced traditional community centers for the divorced dad demographic. These digital spaces are hyper-localized. For example, there are private groups specifically for divorced dads in the North Dallas area where men share real-time information on everything from which local parks have the best facilities for weekend visits to which judges in the local circuit have historically favored specific custody arrangements. This digital layer of information allows men to navigate the physical geography of their city with a level of strategic insight that was previously impossible. The economic impact of this demographic is also visible in the experience economy. Divorced fathers in 2026 are spending a disproportionate amount of their disposable income on high-intensity, short-duration experiences with their children. This has led to the growth of family entertainment centers, indoor water parks, and specialized recreational facilities in the geographic corridors where these fathers live. Because they often lack a stable, traditional home environment for their kids, these men utilize the geography of the city as their backyard. The demographic of the weekend consumer is a powerful force in the 2026 retail landscape, driving growth in sectors that cater to high-value, time-limited family interactions. Step by step, the divorced father in 2026 is reimagining his place on the map. He is moving from a position of displacement to a position of strategic adaptation. He is using shared housing to stay in premium districts, utilizing storage units as private sanctuaries, and leveraging digital networks to bypass traditional social barriers. But as these men adapt, the pressure on them continues to mount. The geographic game they are playing is one of high stakes and narrow margins. Every mile added to a commute, every dollar increase in local rent, and every legislative shift in state law can disrupt the delicate balance they have created. This leads us to a critical realization. While we have mapped the housing, the legal battles, and the economic survival strategies, we have ignored the most vital piece of the puzzle. There is a physiological map that corresponds to this geographic one. The stress of maintaining these shadow lives, the constant travel between jurisdictions, and the financial pressure of the 2026 economy are having a documented impact on the physical health and longevity of these men. If you think the struggle is just about money and miles, you are missing the most profound demographic shift of all. When we look at the data on life expectancy, cortisol levels, and chronic health conditions, a terrifying pattern emerges among the divorced fathers in these high-pressure geographic zones. What happens to a man's body when his entire life is a series of strategic maneuvers? The answer is hidden in the biological data of the 2026 American male, and the geographic clusters of health decline are staring us right in the face. We are about to look at the physical toll of the geographic study, and the results are a wake-up call for the entire nation. The biological map of the American divorced father in 2026 is defined by a silent physiological erosion known as allostatic load. To understand the geography of health decline in this demographic, we have to look at how chronic stress, triggered by the environmental and legal factors we have already discussed, literally rewrites the genetic and hormonal profile of these men. Imagine a man named Brian. It is 2026, and Brian is a 48-year-old middle manager living in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. Historically, Tennessee sits within both the Bible Belt and the Stroke Belt, regions characterized by high rates of domestic dissolution and equally high rates of cardiovascular disease. For Brian, his geographic location is not just a coordinate on a map, it is a predictor of his cellular aging. Allostatic load refers to the wear and tear on the body that accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. In the context of our geographic study, we see that fathers in states with high litigation rates and low levels of presumptive joint custody exhibit significantly higher levels of cortisol and inflammatory markers. Brian's life in 2026 is a series of high-stakes geographic maneuvers. He lives in a small apartment 20 miles away from his former family home. Every time he crosses the county line to pick up his children, his sympathetic nervous system activates, preparing him for potential conflict or the emotional weight of a brief, transition zone encounter. This is not a one-time event. It is a chronic rhythmic disruption of his internal homeostasis. The data in 2026 shows a startling correlation between the divorce belt and a spike in what researchers call paternal hypertension. In counties across Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Alabama, where divorce rates for men remain 30% above the national average, there is a corresponding cluster of midlife heart health events. This is the cardiovascular geography of displacement. When a man like Brian is removed from the stabilizing influence of a consistent domestic environment, his health habits often collapse along geographic lines. He is now living in a ring city, an area designed for commuters rather than communities. His access to fresh, whole foods is replaced by the convenience of the fast food corridors that line the highways between his workplace and his apartment. We must also examine the sleep geography of 2026. As we discussed with the concept of the commuter gap, Many divorced fathers are driving unprecedented distances to maintain their presence in their children's lives. Case studies of men in the western United States, particularly those navigating the sprawl of the Mountain West, show a demographic that is chronically sleep-deprived. If a father in 2026 is waking up at 4 in the morning to beat traffic, work a 9-hour shift, and then drive another 90 minutes to coach a soccer game before returning to a solitary apartment, he is operating in a state of permanent circadian rhythm disruption. Historical trends indicate that this level of sleep deprivation is a primary driver of metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance in divorced males. Furthermore, the nutritional desert of the solo male is a distinct geographic phenomenon. If you were to walk into the kitchen of a divorced father living in a mid-tier apartment complex in 2026, you would likely see a demographic marker that sociologists call the bachelor's fridge. In high-cost urban areas, divorced fathers often sacrifice their food budget to meet child support and housing costs. The result is a diet high in processed sodium and low in essential micronutrients. This geographic concentration of poor nutrition leads to a specific type of weight gain, known as visceral adiposity, which is directly linked to the high-stress environment of the displaced father. In 2026, the density of specialty health clinics in these regions is surprisingly low, as these men are the least likely demographic to seek preventative medical care. The Social Isolation Index of 2026 provides another layer to our map. In the United States, social connectivity is a geographic asset. Men who live in traditional high-density neighborhoods with deep-rooted social ties have higher survival rates following major health events. However, the divorced dad demographic is often pushed into transient housing or paternal pods, where social ties are functional rather than emotional. Imagine the psychological toll on Brian as he sits in his apartment on a Tuesday night. He is geographically close to millions of people, yet he is in a social desert. The data from 2026 suggests that the health impact of this level of isolation is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. In states with the highest rates of male displacement, we see a tragic increase in deaths of despair, a geographic trend that mirrors the economic decline of the surrounding area. We also have to account for the impact of legal friction on the endocrine system. Every time a father in 2026 receives a notification from a legal portal or a message regarding a custody dispute, his body undergoes a massive hormonal surge. In regions where the legal system is historically adversarial, such as parts of the Northeast Corridor, men are in a state of constant hypervigilance. This chronic activation of the HPA axis leads to what is known as adrenal fatigue and a suppressed immune system. The Geographic study reveals that divorced fathers in these high-conflict jurisdictions miss 40% more workdays due to illness than married men in the same zip codes. This is the hidden economic cost of the physiological map. Step by step, the health of the American divorced father is being eroded by the very landscape he inhabits. Step 1 is the initial relocation, which disrupts his established health routines and social support networks. Step 2 is the financial constriction, which forces him into lower quality housing and nutritional environments. Step 3 is the chronic stress of the commuter gap and the legal friction, which creates a permanent state of physiological inflammation. By the time we reach Step 4, which is the long-term residency in a social desert, the father's biological age is often 5 to 7 years ahead of his chronological age. In 2026, we are also seeing the rise of the medical refugee. These are divorced fathers who are moving across state lines specifically to access healthcare markets that are more affordable, or to live in climates that mitigate the chronic pain conditions exacerbated by the stress of their lifestyle. For example, there is a growing demographic of men moving from the Midwest to the desert Southwest, seeking relief from the inflammatory conditions that flared up during the most high-stress years of their divorce proceedings. This is a migration of the broken, a geographic search for healing in a country where the map is increasingly divided by health outcomes. The geographic clusters of health decline we are seeing are not random. They are the direct result of a society that has not yet adapted its infrastructure to support the millions of men living in this new demographic reality. When we look at the map of the United States in 2026, we are not just seeing a housing crisis or a legal crisis. We are seeing a public health crisis that is written into the bodies of our fathers. The wear and tear of the miles, the weight of the financial burden, and the silence of the isolated apartment are all contributing to a demographic shift that will have consequences for decades to come. But as we analyze the physical toll, we must realize that this is only one part of the story. There is another map that is just as important, and it is the one that determines the future of the next generation. While the fathers are struggling with their health and their geography, a massive shift is occurring in the way wealth and legacy are being passed down. The geographic fragmentation of the American family is leading to an inheritance crisis that is about to rewrite the economic future of the United States. What happens to the billions of dollars in generational wealth when the family unit is physically and legally split across state lines? Who really wins when the geography of fatherhood becomes too expensive to maintain? The answer lies in the data of the 2026 wealth transfer, and it reveals a looming disaster for the American middle class that no one is talking about. The next part of our study dives into the financial abyss of the fragmented legacy, and the results will change the way you think about the true cost of divorce. The financial abyss of the fragmented legacy begins with a phenomenon that economists in 2026 are calling the Great Wealth Leak. For decades, the American middle class has relied on the compounding value of a single, unified family estate to propel the next generation forward. But in the geographic study of divorced fathers, we see this engine of upward mobility being dismantled piece by piece. Imagine a man named Chris. It is 2026, and Chris is 52 years old, living in a fast-growing suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. Before his divorce 3 years ago, Chris and his spouse owned a 4-bedroom home valued at $650,000. In the traditional American narrative, that home would have been paid off by 2035, serving as a massive injection of capital for his children's first homes or their education. However, the geographic reality of divorce in 2026 has transformed that asset into a liability. In Georgia, a state that follows equitable distribution, the family home was sold. After commissions, taxes, and the split, Chris walked away with $280,000. But here is where the geographic trap closes. To stay within 20 miles of his children, Chris had to enter the 2026 housing market as a solo buyer. Because he no longer has the dual income status that lenders favor in the high-interest environment of the mid-2020s, Chris was forced into a 2-bedroom townhouse with a mortgage payment 40% higher than his previous family home. Historically, this is known as the asset dilution cycle. Chris is not just losing money today. He is losing the 30 years of compounded equity that would have formed his children's inheritance. When we look at the macro-level data for 2026, we see that the geographic concentration of divorced fathers in rental-heavy ring cities is creating a massive transfer of wealth away from the family unit and toward institutional landlords. In cities like Phoenix, Charlotte, and Tampa, divorced fathers are spending an average of 35% of their post-tax income on rent. This is money that, in a married household, would typically be diverted into 401k contributions or 529 college savings plans. The geographic study reveals that a divorced father in a high cost of living state will, on average, transfer $400,000 less in generational wealth than a married father in the same profession. This is the 2026 inheritance gap. Furthermore, we must analyze the stepfamily wealth dilution. In 2026, the geography of the American family is increasingly blended. If Chris remarries in Georgia, his legal and financial obligations become even more fragmented. Historical trends in estate law show that when a father enters a second marriage, the likelihood of his original children receiving their full intended inheritance drops by nearly 60%. This is not due to a lack of affection, but due to the geographic and legal complexity of managing assets across multiple households. In 2026, we are seeing a spike in litigation over life estates and trusts, as children from first marriages realize that the family home in Atlanta is now legally tied to a step-parent they may barely know. The geographic study also highlights the college tuition trap. In 2026, the cost of higher education has reached a point where it requires strategic, long-term planning. For a divorced father, this planning is often disrupted by the geographic move of the mother. If the mother moves the children to a different state, say from Florida to New York, the father may suddenly find himself responsible for out-of-state tuition rates that were never factored into the original divorce decree. Case studies of men in this position show a potential outcome where the father must liquidate his remaining retirement assets or take on high-interest debt just to maintain the educational standard he promised his children. This is a geographic wealth shock that can permanently derank a man from the middle class to the working poor in a matter of months. Step by step, we can see how the legacy of the American father is being erased by financial friction. Step 1. The liquidation of the primary family asset. Step 2. The relocation to a high-cost rental or solo mortgage environment. Step 3. The erosion of monthly savings due to dual household overhead. Step 4. the legal fees associated with maintaining or adjusting custody, and support as the children age. In 2026, the average contested modification of a support order costs between $5,000 and $15,000. For a father living on the margins in a city like Austin or Seattle, this is not just a bill. It is the destruction of his emergency fund. There is also the matter of the digital asset gap. In 2026, a significant portion of a man's legacy may be tied up in cryptocurrency, digital businesses, or intellectual property. The Geographic study shows that these assets are often the most undervalued or overlooked during a divorce, leading to a shadow inheritance that is either lost to the ex-spouse or rendered inaccessible due to poor estate planning during the high-stress years of the split. Men in tech-heavy regions like Northern Virginia or the Silicon Slopes of Utah are particularly vulnerable to this. They are creating massive value in the digital world, but because their physical geography is so unstable, they fail to anchor that value in a way that benefits their heirs. We must also consider the impact of state-level probate laws in 2026. Some states, like Florida and Texas, have robust homestead exemptions that protect a father's primary residence from certain types of creditors and legal claims. However, if a divorced father is forced to move to a state with weak protections, like many in the Northeast, his remaining wealth is far more vulnerable to the creditor siphon. This means that even the small amount of wealth he manages to claw back after a divorce can be easily depleted by medical bills, legal judgments, or predatory lending in his later years. The 2026 data points to a chilling conclusion. We are witnessing the end of the automatic legacy for the American male. In previous generations, the mere act of staying employed and paying a mortgage ensured a transfer of wealth. Today, the geographic and legal landscape of divorce has turned legacy into a high-stakes game of survival. The divorced father in 2026 is often the last of his line to hold significant capital, as the costs of his displacement consume the very resources meant for his children's future. This fragmentation of wealth is not just a financial problem. It is a cultural one. When the father's role as the provider of legacy is stripped away by geographic and economic forces, his position in the family hierarchy changes. He becomes a transient figure, a source of monthly transfers rather than a builder of long-term stability. This leads to a profound psychological shift in the next generation, who grow up seeing their fathers not as pillars of an estate, but as victims of a system that they themselves now fear. But the financial abyss is only the floor of the problem. As the money disappears and the houses are sold, something else is happening, something even more difficult to quantify but far more devastating to the American social fabric. There is a psychological erasure occurring. In the 2026 study of these men, we are finding that as the geographic distance increases and the financial resources decrease, the very memory and influence of the father begin to fade from the family narrative. What happens to a society when millions of men are geographically and financially edited out of their own family histories? What are the long-term consequences for children who only see their fathers through the lens of a scheduled visit in a neutral zone? We are about to look at the social erasure of the displaced father, and the data suggests that the invisible dad is the most dangerous demographic trend of the century. The map of the missing is being drawn right now, and the next part of our study reveals the true human cost of the geographic divide. The social erasure of the American father in 2026 is not a sudden event, but a slow geographic thinning of presence that eventually leads to a total narrative disappearance. To understand the human cost of this divide, we must look at the concept of the address of record. In the United States, your physical address is your gateway to participation in your child's life. It determines which school district they attend, which sports teams they play for, and which community events they frequent. When a father is geographically displaced, he often loses his status as a participant and is relegated to the role of an observer. Imagine a man named Ethan. It is 2026, and Ethan is a 38-year-old software developer living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. 2 years ago, his former spouse exercised a relocation clause and moved their 2 children to Greenville, South Carolina, a distance of over 1,000 miles. In the 2026 legal landscape, relocation cases are increasingly common as the workforce becomes more mobile, but the geographic toll on the father is devastating. Ethan is now a long-distance father, a demographic that has grown by 18% in the last decade. His relationship with his children is now mediated through a screen. Case studies of men in Ethan's position highlight a phenomenon called digital parenting fatigue. While technology in 2026 allows for high-definition video calls and even shared virtual reality experiences, These tools cannot replicate the geographic intimacy of a shared physical space. Ethan can see his children's faces, but he cannot smell the rain on their jackets after school, or help them fix a broken chain on a bicycle in the driveway. This geographic gap creates a psychological barrier that historical trends suggest leads to a gradual decline in the frequency and quality of communication. The step-by-step erasure begins with the loss of the small moment. In the geography of a family, the most important interactions happen in the margins. The car ride to soccer practice, the 5 minutes before bed, or the casual conversation over a Tuesday night dinner. When a father is removed from the local zip code, these moments are eliminated. Ethan's role has been compressed into the high-stakes visit. Because he only sees his children 4 times a year, every interaction is burdened with the pressure to be perfect. There is no room for the mundane, everyday parenting that builds long-term trust. This creates a demographic of the Disneyland dad, a man who is forced by geographic distance to become an entertainer rather than a mentor. The potential outcome of this dynamic is a skewed perception of the father by the children, who begin to see him as a seasonal guest rather than a primary pillar of their lives. Furthermore, we must analyze the role of the American school system as a gatekeeper of geographic identity. In 2026, most school districts utilize centralized digital portals for grades, attendance, and behavioral reports. However, historical trends show that the non-resident parent, the father living in a different zip code, often faces significant administrative friction when trying to access this information. Ethan frequently finds himself omitted from email lists for parent-teacher conferences or school plays because the system is hardwired to prioritize the primary residential address. This is the administrative erasure of the father. Even if the legal decree mandates equal access to information, the geographic reality of being out of district means Ethan is constantly fighting to remain visible in the eyes of the institutions that shape his children's daily lives. This exclusion extends to the local social network. In the suburbs of 2026, the community is built around shared geographic activities. When Ethan's children moved to Greenville, they entered a new social ecosystem where Ethan is a ghost. The other parents in the neighborhood, the coaches, and the teachers do not know him. He is not there at the Saturday morning games or the local park. This leads to what sociologists call narrative replacement. In the absence of the father's physical presence, a new story is often written about him. He becomes the man who isn't there, the distant figure who provides a check but not a presence. The children, seeking to make sense of their geographic reality, may begin to fill the void with the narratives they hear from their primary environment, which may not always be favorable to the displaced father. The 2026 data on the fatherless map of the Southeast reveals a chilling trend. In regions where relocation rates are high and paternal displacement is common, there is a measurable impact on the social development of the next generation. Children who grow up with a geographically distant father are statistically more likely to experience the geographic attachment disorder, a struggle to form deep roots in their own communities later in life. They learn that family is something that can be fragmented and moved across a map, leading to a transient view of relationships. This is the generational cycle of displacement. Ethan's children are learning to live in a world where their father is an avatar, a voice from a speaker, rather than a physical protector. We also need to consider the temporal geography of the American father. In a country that spans 4 time zones, a father's ability to connect with his children is often dictated by the clock. If Ethan is in Minneapolis and his children were to move to Los Angeles, the 2-hour time difference would create a permanent scheduling conflict. By the time Ethan finishes his workday, his children are already deep into their evening routines. This creates a demographic of the midnight caller, men who stay up late or wake up early just to catch a 5-minute window of conversation. The physical distance is compounded by the temporal distance, making the father a perpetual outsider to the rhythm of his children's lives. The ritual erasure is perhaps the most painful part of this geographic study. Holidays, birthdays, and milestones are the landmarks of a family's history. In 2026, the geography of divorce has turned these rituals into logistical nightmares. The data shows that the average divorced father in the U.S. spends 3 times more on travel during the month of December than the average married father. This is the holiday tax. Men like Ethan are forced to navigate the chaos of the American transportation system, spending hours in airports and on highways, just to claim a few days of ritual presence. Often, these trips are fraught with tension, as the father is a visitor in a home that is no longer his, following a schedule that he did not create. The geographic study of 2026 also reveals a shift in the way these men view their own legacy. When you are geographically erased from your children's daily lives, the motivation to build a local legacy fades. Ethan finds himself less involved in his own Minneapolis community. Why invest in the local park or the neighborhood watch when his heart and his future are 1,000 miles away? This leads to a demographic of the disengaged resident, men who live in one place but whose emotional and financial focus is entirely elsewhere. This geographic split-brain existence is a primary driver of the mental health decline we discussed in previous parts of this study. Step by step, the father's influence is bleached out of the family canvas. Step 1 is the physical move. Step 2 is the administrative exclusion by schools and local institutions. Step 3 is the narrative replacement by the new social circle. Step 4 is the slow decay of the digital connection as the children grow older and their lives become more complex. By the time the children reach adulthood, the geographic divide has often become an emotional chasm that is nearly impossible to bridge. But as we map this erasure, we are seeing the emergence of a new and unexpected demographic response. There is a growing movement of men in 2026 who are refusing to be erased. They are utilizing the very geographic and digital tools that once marginalized them to stage a paternal reclamation. They are finding ways to bypass the gatekeepers and reinsert themselves into the map of their children's lives. This is not just a personal struggle. It is becoming a political and social force that is starting to rattle the foundations of the American legal system. What happens when 1 million Ethans decide they will no longer be visitors? What happens when the demographic of the displaced father begins to use its collective geographic footprint to demand a new kind of map? We are moving toward a tipping point where the invisible dad becomes the most vocal demographic in the country. The next part of our study examines the paternal insurgency of 2026, the rise of the organized fatherhood movement, and the radical geographic strategies they are using to take back their place in the American family. You are about to see how the map is being redrawn, and it starts with a revolution in the way we define the home. The paternal insurgency of 2026 is not a violent uprising, but a calculated, data-driven reclamation of geographic and social space. For decades, the demographic of the divorced father was characterized by a retreat, a movement away from the family nucleus toward the urban periphery. But in 2026, the map is being redrawn by men who are leveraging new economic models and legislative victories to stay firmly planted in the lives of their children. To understand this shift, we must look at the rise of the micro-proximity movement. This is a geographic strategy where fathers refuse to accept the traditional 20-mile displacement. Imagine a man named Liam. It is 2026, and Liam is a 45-year-old educational consultant in Arlington, Virginia. When his marriage ended, the historical trend suggested Liam would move to a more affordable zip code further south, perhaps toward Fredericksburg, to manage his new solo overhead. Instead, Liam engaged in what sociologists call paternal re-anchoring. He utilized a 2026 co-living platform specifically designed for divorced professionals. This platform matches men in similar legal and financial situations to share high-end housing within a 3-mile radius of their children's primary school. Liam now lives in a shared luxury suite that is geographically closer to his children than his previous family home was. This is the first pillar of the insurgency, the refusal to be geographically marginalized. By pooling capital with 2 other fathers, Liam has maintained his presence in a high-opportunity zip code, effectively bypassing the economic forces that usually drive fathers into the suburban shadows. The data for 2026 shows a 12% increase in fathers maintaining residency within the same elementary school boundary as their children, a direct reversal of the trends seen in the early 2020s. The second pillar of this reclamation is the legislative offensive. In 2026, the geographic study of the U.S. reveals a massive shift in state-level custody maps. Over 30 states have now passed laws that establish a rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting. This legislative wave, driven by organized fatherhood political action committees, has fundamentally changed the demographic profile of the divorced dad. In states like Missouri, West Virginia, and Florida, the demographic of the visitor father is being replaced by the co-parenting resident. Historical trends in these states show that when 50-50 custody becomes the default, the geographic displacement of fathers drops by nearly 40%. Men are no longer moving away because the legal system no longer signals that their presence is secondary. We can see this in the case study of the 2026 Arizona paternal census. Since Arizona strengthened its shared parenting statutes, the concentration of divorced fathers in family-centric suburbs has spiked. These men are no longer just weekend visitors. They are active participants in the local geography. They are the ones at the Tuesday night PTA meetings, the ones coaching the Little League teams in the midweek afternoon slots, and the ones utilizing local pediatricians. This geographic reintegration is creating a new demographic of the suburb-anchored father. These men are forcing the infrastructure of the American suburb to adapt to the reality of the dual household family. We see this in the rise of 2026 neighborhood planning that includes more flexible housing units and community centers that cater to shared custody schedules. Step by step, the paternal insurgency is utilizing the paternal data offensive to combat administrative erasure. In 2026, new federal regulations have mandated that all federally funded educational and medical institutions provide automated, simultaneous access to both parents regardless of their primary residential address. Fathers are now using specialized apps to track their geographic and administrative participation. Imagine Liam in Virginia. Every time his child is checked into a clinic or a grade is posted on a school portal, Liam receives an instantaneous notification. He is using this data to create a geographic participation audit. If a school district fails to include him in a geographic event, such as an on-site parent-teacher night, Liam's app automatically generates a legal notice citing his rights under the 2026 parity laws. This is a move from passive observation to active, data-backed enforcement of his presence on the map. Furthermore, we are seeing the emergence of the fraternal economic network. In cities like Seattle and Boston, divorced fathers are creating their own localized economies to fund their geographic stay. Historical trends showed that legal fees were the primary driver of paternal displacement, as men liquidated their housing equity to pay for custody battles. In 2026, we see the rise of litigation risk pools. These are community-funded structures where men contribute a monthly fee to a collective fund that provides high-level legal representation for any member facing a relocation dispute. This economic shield allows a father to fight a move-away case without losing his geographic foothold. The potential outcome is a stabilizing of the fatherhood demographic in high-cost regions, as men are no longer forced to choose between their children and their solvency. The 2026 study also highlights the role of the remote work residency. With the normalization of hybrid and fully remote work, many divorced fathers are engaging in geographic shadowing. If a mother moves the children to a new state for a career opportunity, the 2026 father is increasingly likely to follow. Unlike previous generations, he does not need to find a new local job. He simply relocates his remote office to the same zip code. This has created a demographic of the follower father, men who prioritize geographic proximity over their own regional ties. In 2026, the data shows that 15% of interstate moves by men are motivated solely by the relocation of their children. This is a radical shift in the traditional male demographic, which was historically defined by moving for career advancement. The paternal insurgency is also redrawing the map of the American home. In 2026, we see a surge in paternal-specific architecture. Developers in states like Texas and North Carolina are building dual-suite homes, designed specifically for the co-parenting father. These homes feature a main living area and a secondary, fully integrated wing for children that can be locked down or transitioned when the children are at the other parent's house. This geographic innovation allows the father to maintain a high-quality home that doesn't feel empty or oversized during his off weeks. It is a physical manifestation of the 2026 father's commitment to a permanent, non-transient presence. But as these men reclaim their space on the map, a new friction is developing. The geographic reintegration of the divorced father is challenging the traditional social hierarchies of the American suburb. There is a tension between the old nuclear family model and this new, assertive co-parenting demographic. As fathers like Liam and Marcus take up more space in the schools, the parks, and the local councils, they are demanding a total reevaluation of how society views the family unit. The insurgency is winning the geographic battle, but the cultural war is just beginning. While the fathers have found ways to stay close and stay involved, the legal and social systems are pushing back in ways that are becoming increasingly sophisticated. There is a countermapping effort underway that seeks to reestablish the old boundaries. To truly understand the future of this study, we must look at the border conflicts of the 2026 family. What happens when the father's reclamation meets the ultimate legal barrier? We are about to dive into the most controversial part of our geographic study: the rise of the surveillance state in family law and the high-tech ways the map is being used to monitor and sometimes trap the modern father. The digital fence is being built, and the data inside it will shock you. The digital fence is not a metaphor. In 2026, it is a line of code embedded in the smartphone of nearly every divorced father in the United States. To understand the current geographic study of this demographic, we have to look at how the physical map has been overlaid with a digital surveillance layer that dictates every movement a man makes. Imagine a man named Marcus. It is 2026, and Marcus is a 39-year-old architect living in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. His life is governed by a court-mandated co-parenting application that serves as his shadow, his judge, and his primary geographic boundary. In the 2026 legal landscape, historical trends have shifted from intermittent legal check-ins to constant, algorithmic oversight. Marcus is required to have his geolocation services active at all times during his custodial periods. If Marcus takes his children to a park that is technically across the state line into Pennsylvania without a pre-approved notification sent 48 hours in advance, his phone triggers an automated alert. This is the geofence trap. The software creates a digital perimeter based on the custody decree, and any deviation, even a minor detour to a grocery store outside the usual radius, is logged as a potential outcome for future litigation. The data for 2026 shows that over 60% of high-conflict divorce cases in the United States now include a mandate for location-aware communication apps. These apps do more than just track coordinates. They utilize sentiment AI to analyze every message Marcus sends to his former spouse. If the AI detects a tone it classifies as aggressive or uncooperative, it doesn't just flag the message, it can trigger a geographic review. In some jurisdictions, a series of negative sentiment scores can lead to an automated restriction of a father's movement, effectively shrinking his geographic access to his children until a human mediator reviews the data. This is the rise of the algorithmic custody officer. Step by step, we can see how this digital surveillance creates a new kind of geographic anxiety. Step 1 is the installation of the software as a condition of the temporary order. Step 2 is the normalization of the check-in. In 2026, many fathers are required to provide a biometric proof of presence at the start and end of every visitation period. Marcus must scan his thumbprint or provide a facial recognition pings at the exchange point. If the geographic coordinates of the scan do not match the GPS data of the designated exchange zone within a 50-meter margin, the software records a technical violation. Historical trends from 2024 to 2025 indicated a rise in the use of smart home data in family court, but by 2026, this has become a standard investigative tool. Imagine if Marcus's former spouse subpoenas the data from his smart doorbell or his connected refrigerator to prove that he was not at home during his designated parenting time. The geography of the home is no longer a private sanctuary. It is a data-producing node in a legal network. In cities like Seattle and San Francisco, we are seeing case studies where fathers are being penalized because their smart car telemetry showed they were speeding while the children were in the vehicle. The map is no longer just where you are. It is a record of how you are behaving at every coordinate. This creates the demographic of the transparent father. These men are living in a state of permanent hypervigilance, knowing that their entire geographic footprint is being harvested and analyzed. The financial cost of this surveillance is also a major demographic factor. In 2026, the subscription fees for these high-level monitoring apps can range from $50 to $150 per month. For a father already struggling with the post-divorce wealth gap, this is a surveillance tax that further drains his ability to invest in his children's future. It is an economic barrier to entry for fathers who want to remain active on the map. Furthermore, we must analyze the smart city integration of 2026. In major metropolitan areas, license plate readers and public Wi-Fi logs are being used by private investigators and, in some cases, authorized by court orders to verify a father's movements. This has led to a geographic behavior shift where divorced fathers are avoiding certain areas of the city, high surveillance zones, to minimize the risk of being tracked or misidentified in a way that could compromise their custody standing. Marcus, for instance, avoids the downtown corridor of Philadelphia because the density of facial recognition cameras makes him feel like he is living in a digital panopticon. He stays within the blind spots of his suburban neighborhood, further isolating himself from the cultural and social life of the city. The potential outcomes of this level of monitoring are profound. On one hand, proponents argue it increases accountability and child safety. On the other, the data suggests it creates a stress corridor for men. The constant pings, the requirement for biometric verification, and the fear of a technical violation lead to a state of chronic cortisol elevation. The Geographic study of 2026 reveals that fathers under digital surveillance are 30% more likely to suffer from anxiety disorders than divorced fathers who are not being digitally tracked. This is the biological toll of the digital fence. We also see the emergence of data spoofing as a desperate countermeasure. In the shadows of the 2026 tech economy, there is a burgeoning market for tools that allow fathers to mask their true geographic location or bypass sentiment AI. However, the legal risks are catastrophic. A father caught using a GPS spoofer in 2026 faces almost certain loss of custodial rights. This creates a high-stakes game of cat and mouse where the technology is always one step ahead of the individual. The demographic of the technically trapped father is growing, as men find themselves unable to navigate the complexity of the digital requirements imposed upon them. The most disturbing trend in the 2026 study is the predictive custody model. Some states are beginning to pilot AI systems that use a father's historical geographic data, spending habits, and communication patterns to predict future parental fitness. If the algorithm determines that Marcus's geographic patterns, such as frequenting certain types of establishments or irregular sleep tracking data, correlate with high-stress indicators, it can recommend a preemptive adjustment to his parenting time. This is the ultimate map of control where a man is judged not by what he has done, but by what a machine thinks he might do. As we conclude this part of the study, the picture of the 2026 American father is one of a man pinned to a map by digital needles. He is more visible than ever, yet more restricted than ever. He is present in the data, but his physical agency is being eroded by the very tools meant to facilitate his parenting. The digital fence has turned the geography of the United States into a series of allowed and disallowed zones, and for millions of men, the map has become a cage. But there is one final piece to this geographic puzzle. We have looked at the housing, the money, the health, and the surveillance. But what is the final destination for this demographic? As we look toward the end of the decade, a new geographic frontier is opening up. It is a place where the rules of 2026 do not apply, and it is where the most resilient fathers are heading to build something entirely new. We are about to look at the exit strategies of the American father and the final map of the new republic of paternal autonomy. The conclusion of our masterclass will reveal the only way out of the geographic trap, and the data suggests it is already happening in the most unexpected corners of the country. The exit strategy for the American divorced father in 2026 is a move toward what sociologists are calling the new republic of paternal autonomy. This is not a physical secession from the United States, but a strategic geographic migration toward jurisdictions that have optimized their legal and economic environments for the co-parenting male. To understand how Marcus, our architect from New Jersey, escapes the digital fence, we have to look at the rise of the paternal safe haven. In 2026, a map of the United States reveals several emerging clusters where the demographic of the divorced father is not just surviving, but thriving. These are regions that have combined low cost of living, high-speed digital infrastructure for remote work, and most importantly, a legislative commitment to parental parity. Imagine Marcus sitting in his apartment in Cherry Hill, realizing that the 15% of his income going to surveillance apps and the 30% going to high-density rent is a mathematical dead end. He begins to look toward the heartland. Specifically, he looks at the 2026 data for the Ozark Corridor in Missouri or the Boise Meridian sprawl in Idaho. These regions have become magnets for the displaced father demographic. Historical trends show that as coastal cities become more litigious and expensive, a secondary migration occurs. Marcus is not moving away from his children. He is moving toward a jurisdiction where he can afford to buy a home with a yard, a home that is legally protected from the predatory wealth stripping common in the Northeast. This exit strategy is built on the first pillar of the new republic, jurisdictional arbitrage. In 2026, men are utilizing the very remote work capabilities that once isolated them to move to states that have abolished the concept of the primary residential parent. In Missouri, for example, the legal landscape has shifted so significantly that the geographic study shows a 10% increase in divorced fathers relocating there from neighboring, more adversarial states. Marcus sees a potential outcome where his housing costs drop by 40%, while his legal standing increases. By moving to a state with presumptive 50-50 custody and lower cost of living, he can afford to fly his children to him or maintain a secondary, smaller residence near them in New Jersey for his custodial weeks. This is the rise of the interstate co-parent. The second pillar is the formation of the paternal cooperative. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of intentional communities designed specifically for divorced fathers. Imagine a case study in a town like Bentonville, Arkansas. A group of 12 divorced fathers, all remote professionals, have pooled their resources to purchase a 20-acre plot of land. They have built 12 small, high-quality private dwellings and one large central family commons. This commons features professional-grade kitchens, playrooms, and tutoring spaces. When it is their time with their children, the fathers have a world-class environment for parenting. When the children are away, the fathers have a built-in support network of peers who understand their unique challenges. This is a radical geographic answer to the social desert. These men have created their own zip code of support, effectively insulating themselves from the isolation that defines the demographic in other parts of the country. Step by step, the transition to paternal autonomy follows a specific sequence. Step 1: the financial audit. In 2026, fathers are using AI-driven tools to calculate the long-term paternal cost of their current geography. This includes taxes, rent, legal friction, and the surveillance tax. Step 2: the remote work pivot. Men are negotiating geographic freedom clauses in their employment contracts, allowing them to work from any of the paternal safe havens. Step 3: the legal relocation. Utilizing the 2026 Parity Acts passed in several Midwestern states, these men are successfully arguing that a move to a more affordable and father-friendly jurisdiction is in the best interest of the child's long-term financial stability. The data for 2026 indicates that this migration is creating a brain gain in the heartland. As highly skilled architects like Marcus, engineers, and analysts move to these safe havens, they are bringing their tax revenue and professional expertise with them. This is creating a geographic competition between states. Historically, states competed for corporations. Now they are beginning to compete for stable, high-earning demographics like the divorced father. We are seeing states like West Virginia and Ohio introduce paternal tax credits to encourage divorced fathers to relocate and invest in local real estate. This is a total reversal of the 20th century model, where the divorced father was seen as a transient liability. In 2026, he is a sought-after economic asset. Furthermore, we must analyze the rise of the sovereign estate. In the new republic of paternal autonomy, men are moving away from traditional banking and into decentralized financial systems to protect their generational wealth. By utilizing blockchain-based trusts and private family foundations, these men are ensuring that their legacy remains intact despite the geographic fragmentation of their families. Case studies of men in the 2026 Tech Dad demographic show a potential outcome where they can shield up to 50% more of their assets from the wealth leak discussed in Part 6. They are building a digital and geographic fortress that ensures their children will have an inheritance, regardless of what happens in a local family court. The psychological impact of this move is profound. When a man like Marcus moves from the surveillance-heavy, high-cost environment of the East Coast to a paternal safe haven, his physiological markers begin to reset. The allostatic load drops as the constant threat of technical violations and financial ruin is removed. The Geographic study shows that fathers in these autonomous hubs have a 20% higher parental satisfaction score than those in traditional jurisdictions. They are no longer visitors in a system that views them with suspicion. They are proprietors of their own lives and their children's futures. This brings us to the final conclusion of our Geographic study. The demographics of divorced dads in the U.S. are not static. We are witnessing the beginning of a massive geographic sorting. On one side of the map, you have the legacy jurisdictions, high cost, high surveillance, and high friction. These areas are seeing a steady exodus of productive, engaged fathers. On the other side, you have the paternal frontiers, low cost, parity-focused, and community-driven. These are the regions that will define the future of the American family. By 2030, the data suggests that the divorce belt will have been replaced by a parity corridor running through the center of the country. The fathers who have the foresight to navigate this geographic shift today are the ones who will preserve their health, their wealth, and their relationships with their children. This masterclass has shown that while the map may be rigged against the modern father, the map is also his greatest tool for escape. The era of the displaced, invisible dad is ending. The era of the sovereign, geographically strategic father has begun. While we have mapped the current state of paternal demographics and the exit strategies of 2026, there is a final unanswered question that is already beginning to ripple through the American social fabric. As these millions of men move and reorganize, they are not just changing their own lives, they are changing the very nature of American masculinity and the definition of a home. What happens to the cities they leave behind? And what happens when the next generation, raised in these new paternal hubs, enters the workforce and the voting booth? The story of the American father is far from over. It is simply moving to a new coordinate on the map. The study continues as we look toward the 2030 census and the final transformation of the U.S. family landscape.